for a session entitled Motivations for Giyyur in Historical Perspective, the Ideal and the Real. So Miriam Bodian is Professor Emerita at the University of Texas, Austin. She's a historian of early modern Jewish history, specializing in Iberian Jewry, the history of the Inquisition, and European Jewry during the Reformation period. Her book, Hebrews of the Portuguese Nation, Conversos and Community in Early Modern Amsterdam, received two major book awards. It traces the history of Portuguese conversos, that is, Jews who converted to Christianity during the Inquisition, who settled in Amsterdam in the 17th century. The book explores how these migrants fashioned a cohesive community life and recreated a Jewish identity while preserving elements of their Iberian heritage. In her book, Dying in the Law of Moses, Crypto-Jewish Martyrdom in Iberian Lands, Miriam Bodian examined the Inquisition dossier of four men who developed Judaizing theologies in the late 16th century. In doing so, she not only showed the emergence of a new type of martyr, an educated one who engaged in disputes with inquisitors, but also revealed connections between Reformation thought and forms of crypto-Judaism, which is pretty fascinating. Miriam Bodian is also a key reference for all scholars interested in conversion related to the Jewish world. Her recent book, titled simply Conversion, offers a brilliant overview of the different ways in which the boundary between the Gentile and the Jew has been crossed from biblical times to the present. Although this is an ambitious project that spans a vast chronological and geographical scope, Miriam achieved to make her book clear and engaging, highlighting the major issues at stake while remaining remarkably accessible to readers. Truly impressive. So before giving the floor to Miriam, I will briefly mention a few elements of the present context that make her work not only illuminating, but essential. We are living in a time marked by increased religious mobility, in which processes of assimilation among Jews intersect with unprecedented waves of interest in Judaism. The growing appeal of Judaism has been facilitated by different factors, such as the spread of the internet, which has made Judaism accessible in regions of the world where people knew nothing about it or didn't have access to it. The proliferation of Hebrew roots churches and Judaizing movements like evangelical Judaizing churches, Kabbalah centers, etc., which encourage the study of the Old Testament and the adoption of Jewish rituals as part of a broader trend of search for roots. And the amendment of nationality laws in Portugal and in Spain, which brought to the surface the forgotten history of the Bnei Anusim, who were Jews who converted to Christianism under the Inquisition, and led many to search for Jewish ancestry. So, Professor Bodian, we're extremely grateful to have you join us tonight, and the floor is yours. There will be time for questions after the presentation.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I can't be there in Beersheba. Some things are out of our control. Historians can bend the past in ways that don't fit reality, but they can't bend the present. So I'm sorry we have to do it by Zoom. I want to discuss the motivations, what motivations and whose motivations have been at play in the historical practice of conversion to Judaism, looking first at the classical rabbinic period and the medieval period before turning to the modern period. I especially want to show how in the modern period, in three quite different contexts, a kind of inversion of the traditional model took place as Jewish actors took the initiative to bring about the conversion of certain categories of non-Jews. So I tried to choose a topic that fits both this year's specific theme of intra-religious disputes and divisions and the center's broader overall theme of conversion. This topic is one that suggested itself to me when I was working on the book that Melissa kindly mentioned. It's a book in the series, Keywords in Jewish Studies, that deals with conversion both in and out of Judaism. Giyyur was a new thing in the world of antiquity. Conversion to another set of beliefs was unheard of in the ancient world, where there was no concept of religion as a compartmentalized, distinct category of human life. The idea that a person could leave his or her ancestral religion for another on religious grounds was unimaginable for Israelites as well as for other peoples. When farm women were absorbed into an Israelite community through marriage, they didn't convert. It was simply taken for granted that they would adapt to the cult of their husband's household. Scholars are pretty much in agreement that something we can call conversion to Judaism first appeared in the late Second Temple period, when it was becoming possible to think of Judaism as a kind of citizenship akin to being Hellenized, or as a moral and intellectual path, as akin to being, for example, a Neoplatonist. That is something that could be acquired by anyone. Non-Jews in this period associated themselves with Jews in various ways. They participated in synagogue services, Jewish festivals, and I think very interestingly, Alexandrian Jews celebrated with Jews the annual celebration of the completion of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Bible, which would have given them, if they had access to the text, would have given them to the book, to the scroll, would have given them access to Jewish scripture. Some of them observed the Sabbath. We don't know a lot about it, but it was presumably these Gentiles' close association and attraction to Jews and Judaism that led to a practice of conversion, making it possible for them to actually become Jews. Based on what we know from the written sources, this entailed the converts' acceptance of Mosaic law, including circumcision for men. And these gerim, or they're known in Greek as proselytes, were regarded as full members of the Jewish community, something we know from ossuary inscriptions. These inscriptions, this one with some color-coded, gives you the name of, it's not actually a ger, but it's the most legible one I could find, Yehonatan ben Hager Zol. And these proselytes were buried in the same caves as Jews by ancestry, which makes clear that they were accepted fully as Jews. Why were they attracted to Judaism? So scholars have speculated about this, but I don't want to go into their speculations. I'll just mention that Philo, the Alexandrian Jewish philosopher, who may well have known converts, ascribed to them the most virtuous of motivations. He wrote that they, quote, spurned idle fables and embraced truth in its purity, joining, quote, a new and God-loving civic community. He praised them for having left, quote, their homeland, their friends, and their relatives for the sake of virtue and holiness, a reference to the act of Abraham in uprooting himself from his land, his birthplace, and his father's house. Philo, at least, saw the converts' readiness for such sacrifice as evidence of their righteous motivations. It was only in the Talmudic period that a fixed procedure for Giyyur under rabbinic supervision was formally laid out. I won't go into the details, but according to a key Talmudic passage, and this is important, the potential convert was to come of his or her volition before a Beit Din. And the establishment of a Beit Din for the purpose of both instructing and judging a potential convert was a rabbinic innovation. The Beit Din would decide whether a candidate for Giyyur was accepted for conversion or not after weighing his or her motivations. If allowed to proceed, potential converts would be given some not too onerous instruction in Jewish law. Male converts would be circumcised. Both male and female converts would be immersed in a ritual bath, also a rabbinic innovation. But the point I want to make here is that they're coming before the Beit Din themselves and are being interrogated or questioned in some way about their motivations. There was agreement that ideally the motivation of the convert should be religious, in rabbinic terms, l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven. That is, in order to serve God by accepting the yoke of the commandments. But opinions differed about those who did not fit the ideal. Some Tanaim held that the conversion of a non-Jew who had ulterior motives was to be invalidated, even after the fact. But this view wasn't accepted as halakha if the convert verbally committed to observe the commandments, he or she wasn't doubted. The rabbis enumerated various unacceptable motivations for conversion in their usual vivid style, but only one of them is relevant to this discussion. Conversion either for the sake of a man or for the sake of a woman, that is, in order to marry, in the context of marriage, in order to marry a Jew. The unacceptability l'katchila of conversion for the sake of marriage became firmly established in halakha. It was reiterated by Maimonides and by the Shulchan Aruch to name the most important codes of Jewish law. Still, the rabbis ruled that if, after a conversion, a convert was found to have unacceptable motives, the conversion was nevertheless valid. Only a handful of converts are mentioned in the early centuries CE, either in Palestine or Babylonia. And the assumption is that after the destruction of the Second Temple and the crushing defeat of the Bar Kokhba revolt, Jewish life may have had little appeal for Jews. Seth Schwartz has maintained that a demoralized Jewish population in Roman Palestine essentially accommodated to Roman dominion, becoming paganized or semi-paganized, but that is also speculation. We don't know. But a Tannaitic passage is suggestive. It holds that a Beit Din, when considering whether to accept a convert, should first warn them of the adversity they were likely to face as a Jew under the conditions of exile. This was intended to encourage a potential convert with unsuitable motivations to withdraw. It explicitly makes that clear. And here, if you can you all read this, or is it blocked by? You can read, okay.
Yes.
So this is a passage from the tractate Yevamot, which has the key passages about conversion, about Giyyur. With regard to a potential convert who comes to a court in order to convert at the present time when the Jews are in exile, the judges of the court say to him, "What did you see that motivated you to come and convert? Don't you know that the Jewish people at the present time are anguished, suppressed, despised, and harassed, and hardships are frequently visited upon them?" If he says, "I know, and although I'm unworthy of joining the Jewish people and sharing their sorrow, I nevertheless desire to do so," then the court accepts him immediately to begin the conversion process. So this passage implies that the only motivation Gentiles could possibly have to convert under the circumstances was a religious one. I'll just mention that the bold, this is the Sefaria translation, and the bold are the actual words that appear in the Baraita, and the rest is making it comprehensible, legible to people who are not familiar with rabbinic language. In the medieval period as well, the number of voluntary converts was few. Even if here and there a medieval non-Jew sought to convert to Judaism for some other motive, most likely in the hopes of gaining material support from the Jewish community, that wouldn't have been a cause for concern. So who then did convert? The conditions of exile in the medieval period had only worsened, certainly in the Christian sphere. And among other things, conversion to Judaism was theoretically punishable by death, both under Christianity and Islam. A passage in Nitzachon Vetus, which is a 13th century Jewish apologetic work from Germany, reiterates in its own way the theme of the Talmudic passage I just read. The anonymous author wrote that while Jewish apostates left the Jewish community for no other reason than to indulge their appetites, the situation is quite different with regard to proselytes who converted to Judaism. If the proselyte is a man, then he knows that he must wound himself by removing his foreskin through circumcision, that he must exile himself from place to place, that he must deprive himself of worldly goods and fear for his life from the external threat of being killed by the uncircumcised, that is, Christians, and that he'll lack many things that his heart desires. Similarly, a woman proselyte also separates herself from all pleasures. And despite all this, they come to take refuge under the wings of the divine presence, a rabbinic, sort of poetic rabbinic reference to Giyyur. It is evident that they would not do this unless they knew for certain that their ancestral faith was without foundation and that it was all a lie, vanity, and emptiness. So it's not surprising that we know of only about 80 cases of Giyyur in Christian Europe from the 11th to 14th centuries. What do we know about these converts and their motivation? We, of course, only know about cases that left a documentary record, and they are certainly not necessarily typical. In these cases, though, ironically, the church's polemical attacks on Jews and Judaism played a part in the conversion of some Christians to Judaism. This is a 14th century altarpiece, but it gives you a sense of the close interaction of Jews and Christians in religious disputation. Here you see St. Stephen preaching to Jews in a synagogue. Some of them are covering their ears in resistance to the message. Some are debating with St. Stephen. And there are two who are tearing up a text. And I don't know for certain, but my assumption is that this is a Talmud which came under attack, or pages from a Talmud that came under severe attack from the 13th century onward. So there's this interaction at a time when Jews were summoned to engage in public disputations, and the church unleashed a flood of anti-Jewish literature. And some educated Christians were confronted with the difficulty posed by key verses in Hebrew scripture. Their simple, non-allegorical sense seemed to contradict Christian teaching. Why was the Trinity never mentioned directly in the Old Testament? Why did the career of Jesus deviate so strikingly from the career of the Messiah prophesied in the Old Testament? Why was there nothing in the Hebrew Bible to suggest that the old law would be abrogated and replaced by the new, and so on? So it's no accident that so many of the medieval Christian converts to Judaism were clerics and/or nobles, so they were educated, or that a number of them were active after their conversion in anti-Christian polemics. I'll just give briefly two examples. The earliest case on record was that of a 9th century deacon, an assistant to a bishop named Bodo in the court of the Frankish king Louis the Pious. He escaped to the Islamic orbit, as converts to Judaism in Christian lands often did. In Saragossa, which was then under Muslim rule, a chronicler relates that, quote, he let the hair of his head and beard grow long and called himself Eliezer. He studied Torah and engaged in a literary debate in Cordova with a Jewish convert to Christianity. More than a century later, an educated Italian nobleman and Catholic priest, originally named Johannes, converted and took the name Ovadia, which was a very common name adopted by converts in the medieval period, and embarked on a life of wandering in Muslim lands. A letter of recommendation written on his behalf by a rabbi in Aleppo described him as, quote, expert in the study of their, that is, Christians' books, who, quote, because he understood what he read in the books of their false doctrines, that is the Old Testament, decided to turn to the God of Israel, quote, and officially embrace Judaism before Jewish court. In an autobiographical account in Hebrew, Ovadia also related that when he was a child in southern Italy, the conversion to Judaism in Constantinople of an Italian archbishop named Andreas had made a strong impression on him. So even if a Christian who sought to convert was undeniably motivated by religious convictions, the Jewish community had every reason to greet his or her wish to convert with ambivalence. On the one hand, Jews were touched and encouraged by such conversions, which validated their own interpretation of Scripture. But on the other hand, they would have been well aware of the dangers to the community, not just to themselves, but to the community, of aiding and abetting Giyyur. In 13th century Toulouse, a rabbi was burned to death by the Papal Inquisition on a charge of proselytizing, and there were other such incidents. So under the circumstances, it seems reasonable to conclude that only non-Jews who demonstrated obvious religious motivations would have been accepted for conversion. And briefly, the early modern period, which is somewhat different from the medieval, converts again were few, but again, the best documented were highly educated men. Their conversions were an outcome less of polemical confrontation and more a gradual process of extended contact with Jewish life at an everyday level. They may have been familiar with the many works about Jewish customs produced by Christian Hebraists in this period, among them Johannes Buxdorf's massive Synagoga Judaica here. This is a chapter dedicated to how the Jews celebrate the festival of the huts, and here an enlarged picture of this hut. At a time when European expansion stimulated interest in exotic human customs, educated Protestants, well-versed in the Old Testament, might now take an interest in Jewish rituals that had long been dismissed simply as proof that Judaism was a spiritually dead religion, rituals that they could now, to their wonderment, observe Jews still performing. In the Hebrew print industry as well, the intimacy of Christians with Jews and Jewish texts sometimes led to the conversion to Judaism of Christians, although it also, of course, led to the baptism of some Jews. To give one example, this famous Amsterdam Haggadah from 1695, with engravings by a convert, Kvod Morenu v'Rabbeinu Avram Bar Yaakov Mimishpachat Avraham Avinu, from the family of Avraham Avinu, a phrase that would only be used by a convert. Converts like these differed from their medieval predecessors in important respects, but the sociological barriers between Christians and Jews were still formidable. The conditions of Jewish life were still difficult, and it's hard to imagine a non-Jew taking the path of Giyyur for motivations other than religious ones. So from the rabbinic period to the threshold of the modern period, conversions to Judaism were rare, and the converts' motivations were most likely religious. Under these conditions, there was no fundamental challenge to the model of conversion presented in the Talmud, according to which a Gentile presented himself to a Beit Din, which evaluated his motivations and on that basis decided to accept or reject him. So it would be hard actually to exaggerate the impact of modern developments on the conceptualization and practice of conversion. Suddenly, an area of Jewish law that was mostly discussed within the walls of the Beit Midrash assumed enormous importance in Jewish communities throughout the diaspora, at least in places where modern conditions prevailed. Rabbis and Jewish leaders took sides in controversies about conversion that were both halachic and ideological. The fragmentation of Jewish communal structures added to the tensions. So what I want to focus on here is how Jews in a variety of roles, rabbis, communal leaders, Jewish activists, and in Israel, government functionaries, became involved in Giyyur in new ways, acting as motivators with the aim of bringing about the conversion of non-Jews who would not on their own have had any intention or, in some cases, any means of joining a Jewish community. So let me just briefly enumerate the factors at play and the conditions that contributed in one way or another to this development. It's really a list of all the usual suspects: secularization, the breakdown of communal autonomy and authority, the granting of legal equality, emancipation, assimilation, the separation of church and state, the Zionist movement, and the creation of a sovereign Jewish state. The impact wasn't immediate. In the first half of the 19th century, the classic traditional model of Giyyur still mostly held sway, even if the social, ideological, and political foundations that supported it were crumbling. It was a sign of a new era when, in the 1860s, a reform conversion performed in Germany on a woman without her having been ritually immersed and her subsequent reform marriage to a Jew were declared invalid by rabbinic leaders of two other new movements, modern Orthodoxy and the incipient conservative movement. The consensus that had prevailed for centuries, according to which one Beit Din's conversion was acceptable to every other, was breaking down. This case, however, was exceptional at the time, since few non-Jews in Germany had any desire to convert to Judaism. And in fact, conversion to Judaism was prohibited in some German states. In the second half of the 19th century, thinking about how to approach Giyyur was changing in Europe and in the United States in response to the demographic threat that was posed by baptism, intermarriage, and assimilation. Among communal leaders as well as rabbis, there was increasing recognition that Giyyur had a role to play in the fight to ensure Jewish survival. Simply writing off a Jew who chose to marry out as lost to the Jewish community was to turn a blind eye to the demographic crisis. Revising traditional expectations about motivations was unavoidable, at least for all but the most rigid traditionalists. A secular Jew might give romantic love priority over Jewish loyalties by choosing a Gentile partner, but might at the same time feel impelled by the same loyalties to establish a Jewish home. The Gentile partner, for her part, and it was typically a woman, might want to be fully accepted by her husband's Jewish family. She might want to create a harmonious ethos in the home. She might even have an appreciation for Jewish customs and values. If so, she might be willing to undergo Giyyur. But if she was turned away by a rabbinic court because her motivations were not primarily for the sake of heaven, what then would she and her partner do? Might they not find a welcome home in a church? If this happened, the Jewish community would lose both the Jewish spouse and the children of the couple. If, on the other hand, the Gentile partner was accepted for conversion because in her own way she wanted to be a Jew, her Giyyur might contribute to ensuring the preservation of Jewish tradition, however attenuated. So many Orthodox rabbis rejected this line of thinking because it gave priority to sociological considerations and they felt ignored time-honored halachic principles. They flatly prohibited the conversion of a non-Jew who sought conversion in the context of marriage. But some rabbinic scholars sought to reconcile contemporary necessity with the traditional halachic position, and a much cited ruling that reflected a more flexible stance was that of Rav Shlomo Kluger, an influential rabbinic scholar in mid-19th century Brody in Galicia. A local Beit Din sought a ruling from Kluger on the eligibility for Giyyur of a Gentile woman who was in a relationship with a Jew. The two had become romantically attached while the Jew was serving in the army, and they now wanted to marry. Using a bit of exegetical ingenuity, Kluger ruled that the woman was, in fact, eligible for conversion. He used the very conceptual language other rabbis might have used to turn her away. He held that she shouldn't be regarded as someone who was seeking Giyyur only to obtain a man, because in this case she already had a man. The couple could have formalized their union by having the man undergo baptism, allowing them to marry as Christians. But Kluger reasoned since they wanted to marry as Jews, with the woman converting to Judaism, quote, it is proven that their intention is l'shem shamayim. What he seems to have meant by for the sake of heaven was simply the preference of the person seeking conversion to belong to a Jewish community when other, perhaps easier, choices were available. His ruling and subsequent rulings in the same vein by other rabbinic authorities reflected a recognition in some Orthodox quarters that there was a need to adapt to an unprecedented sociological and human reality. Increasingly, not only the potential convert, but the Beit Din as well had an interest in preparing and accepting a candidate for Giyyur. In the late 19th century, the very late 19th century, the reform movement in the United States made a truly radical break with tradition and with traditional Giyyur. The very essence of traditional rabbinic conversion, a commitment to observe the mitzvot in all their particularity, their specificity, their unbending detail, was at odds with the reform movement's essential rejection of halakha and its almost exclusive emphasis on universal ethical monotheism. With their new interpretation of Judaism, reform leaders felt their theology had the power not only to attract Jews, but to attract Christians as well, since the Christological foundations of Christianity seemed to them so contrary to the Enlightenment spirituality that inspired their own movement. It was with the hope of attracting converts that in 1869, the Reform movement decided to remove the requirement of circumcision for male converts. In 1892, its principal organization ruled that converts would be accepted, quote, without any initiatory rite, ceremony, or observance whatever. As Rabbi Samuel Schulman put it in 1908, quote, present conditions require the encouragement, not the discouragement of conversion. But it's in the post-war period that active efforts to convert non-Jews emerged most strikingly in several sectors of the Jewish world, among reform leaders in the United States, among political leaders and government functionaries in Israel, and in geographically remote places far removed from the centers of Jewish life. Excuse me. So it's a good question why we find a similar pattern, a similar dynamic in such different contexts, and I'll get to that. But let me first describe developments in each of these three contexts. I'll start with the United States. In the post-war period, the sheer number of non-Jews seeking to become Jews in all sectors of American Jewish life was unprecedented. The great majority of the converts were women anticipating marriage to a Jew. It's still the case, or women already married to a Jew in a civil ceremony. It was now becoming common for the non-Jewish spouse to abandon his traditional background to marry a Jew, not the other way around. So this development had to do partly with the normalization of Jewish life in the post-war American post-war American society with the mainstreaming of American Jews and Judaism in popular culture and literature, academia, eating habits, and so on. By this time, Jews could choose under whose religious leadership and authority they wished to live, but they could also live entirely secular lives. And increasingly, intermarried couples were doing just that. By the 1970s, more than 4 out of 5 mixed couples lived secular lives and saw no need for anyone to convert. The ever-rising number of such intermarriages, confirmed by statistical studies that were commissioned by Jewish organizations, set off alarm bells among American Jewish leaders who felt they were witnessing a demographic collapse. So under these conditions, there was a shift, or at least a partial shift, in the very locus of motivation for conversion. Jewish motivations were now playing a significant role in the dynamics of Giyyur. Orthodox, conservative, and Reform leaders alike sought to bring into the Jewish community non-Jews who were married to Jews and non-Jews contemplating marriage to a Jew. But it was only the Reform movement that openly declared a campaign to attract non-Jews who did not have any Jewish connections. In 1950, the Reform rabbinate, true to its understanding of the role of the Jews as a light to the Gentiles, or legoim, approved a carefully worded motion to undertake a program to attract non-Jews, more specifically religiously unaffiliated non-Jews, to Judaism. And let me just mention that although Reform leaders have been quite open about what is in effect proselytizing, they've avoided the loaded term proselytizing, and they use the more delicate term outreach. So this new campaign to attract unaffiliated non-Jews was declared to be, quote, not only a right, but an obligation and a responsibility. That is, it was a responsibility and an obligation of the Jews to give as much information as possible on Judaism to the non-Jew. A program was launched in 1978 after Alexander Schindler, a leader of the Reform movement, called on Reform Jews to abandon traditional attitudes and begin a conversion campaign aimed not only at intermarried non-Jews, but also at non-practicing, in his words, unchurched Christians who were not intermarried. It was big enough news to make the front page of the New York Times. Here you see the article. Reform leader urges a program to convert seekers to Judaism. These are Schindler's words. I believe the time has come for the Reform movement and others, if they're so disposed, to launch a carefully conceived outreach program aimed at all Americans who are unchurched and who are seeking religious meaning. It would be easy to tiptoe here, to use obfuscatory language, and to be satisfied to hint at my purpose. But I will not. Unabashedly and urgently, I propose that we resume our vocation as champions of Judaism, that we move from passive acceptance to affirmative action. Different meaning to affirmative action than our own. Conservative and Orthodox leaders roundly denounced this idea, but in 1979, the flagship organization of the Reform movement, undeterred by the criticism, established an outreach program in the spirit of Alexander Schindler's proposal. Further steps were subsequently taken to bring non-Jews into the fold. In 1983, the Reform movement recognized as Jews the children of Jewish fathers and non-Jewish mothers, as long as they were being raised with a Jewish identity. So this unilateral action, in effect served to convert an entire category of non-Jews who had significant Jewish ancestry. I want to turn now to the very different case of the state of Israel, where Jewish efforts to bring about Giyyur have a quite different history, even though here too a demographic problem has provided special impetus. So I'll try to simplify a complex story with ever-changing institutional names and actors. When the State of Israel was founded, the status quo agreement, as I'm sure you know, so-called because it perpetuated an arrangement under Ottoman and British rule, granted exclusive authority to the chief rabbinate in matters of personal law, including Giyyur. Only conversions conducted by regional rabbinic courts under the supervision of the chief rabbinate were accepted as valid by the state. In 1950, when Israel was absorbing massive immigration from both post-Holocaust Europe and Arab countries, the law of return was enacted to grant automatic citizenship to Jewish immigrants. In 1970, the law of return was amended to make non-Jewish family members who immigrated to Israel eligible for citizenship. And here is the front page of the Jerusalem Post with a bold headline. These immigrants became citizens, but their personal status remained that of non-Jews. This situation, of course, was fraught with problems. Secular Zionists who dominated public life in this period held that the conditions of Jewish life in the state of Israel rendered rabbinic law obsolete in determining who was a Jew. David Ben-Gurion, whose mamlachti ideology was widely shared by other secular Zionists, put it this way: here in Israel, we are not a minority under pressure of a foreign culture, and there is no fear of assimilation of Jews among non-Jews. While abroad, mixed marriages are one of the decisive factors in the total assimilation and in the abandonment of Judaism, the couples in mixed marriages arriving here, especially from Eastern Europe, actually fuse completely with the Jewish people. The conditions of exile had been, as it were, reversed, so that the dominant dynamic was now one of the assimilation of the Gentile, not of the Jew. In Ben-Gurion's secular Israeli conception of Jewishness, the Gentile partner would blend into Israeli Jewish society by a natural process, much as had occurred in biblical times, and he evoked biblical precedents for his view. From his perspective, there was no need for a rabbinic or any other conversion process. Historical forces would Judaize anyone who settled in Israel and regarded themselves as a Jew. Of course, it was also part of his thinking that the state needed people and shouldn't discourage them from coming. In the end, of course, Ben-Gurion couldn't do without the support of religious parties, and as a pragmatic matter, he accepted traditional criteria for conversion. This meant that children with non-Jewish mothers and spouses of Jews needed to be accepted for Giyyur by a rabbinic court in order to be registered in the population registry as Jews. In the 1970s, public pressure grew in Israel to create a less stringent path to conversion. In the wake of the Six-Day War in 1967, increasing numbers of non-Jewish volunteers were arriving on kibbutzim, marrying kibbutznikim, and staying. Non-Jewish spouses were also arriving with the trickle of Jewish immigrants from the Soviet Union. When these immigrants turned to the rabbinic courts for conversion, they were routinely rejected because it was clearly not their intention to conduct their lives according to halakha. The chief architect of an alternative path was Shlomo Goren, the chief Ashkenazi rabbi from 1972 to 1983. As head of the military rabbinate prior to this, he had already introduced a program for conducting the conversion of non-Jewish soldiers, which was far more lenient than the rabbinates. In 1977, as chief rabbi, he established a network of conversion classes and special conversion courts whose religious Zionist dayanim he appointed. Goren's thinking and activity around conversion departed conspicuously from the rabbinic model. It was the role of the state, he believed, to actively support and encourage the conversion of non-Jewish immigrants. The Jewish people in Israel were being molded anew by the state and its institutions, and non-Jews seeking conversion in Israel should be dealt with leniently because they would be eventually assimilated by a natural process. by shifting the focus from the inner motivations of converts to the power of the environment to condition them, Goren placed national and sociological considerations squarely within the orbit of halachic reasoning about Giyyur. But after Golan stepped down in 1983, the Special Conversion Court's activity was curtailed under increasing Haredi influence. Conversions once again came under the purview of the regional rabbinic courts under the chief rabbinate with their stringent requirements. But the number of non-Jewish immigrants was only growing. In 1989, with the fall of the Soviet Union, the floodgates opened. According to the Ministry of Absorption, the Misrad HaKlita, between 1990 and 2001, more than 200,000 immigrants from the former Soviet Union were registered as non-Jews in the population registry, a number that has grown substantially in subsequent years. Their number has also grown in proportion to the number of Jewish immigrants from the former Soviet Union, from about 20% of the total in the 1990s to more than 50% in 2019. In 1995, hoping to ease the process, the state took direct control of conversions, establishing standards for instruction during the convert's preparatory period and reinstating the special conversion courts that Rav Goren had introduced. And then the story becomes, I would say, the more secular institutions of Israeli life began to enter the picture in a more radical way. In 2003, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon placed these courts under a new conversion administration, which exists today, the Ma'arach HaGiyyur, under the Prime Minister's office. The reason for this transfer, according to a senior staff member, was, quote, to convey the message that the state has an interest in conversion. As a former Labor Knesset member likewise put it in 2005, the conversion of as many non-Jewish former Soviet Union immigrants as possible was a national interest and served, quote, the collective desire of all, religious and secular, Orthodox and non-Orthodox, to preserve and strengthen the Jewish majority in the state of Israel. The instructors who prepared candidates for conversion in the new program, almost all of them from the National Religious Camp, tended to share this view, although they were also, of course, committed to instilling prospective converts with a knowledge of Jewish tradition, or as one of them once put it to me, they should have a Jewish lifestyle, he said. However, after undergoing preparation, prospective converts were required to appear before Beit Din under the chief rabbinate to be accepted, or, as was often the case, to be told he or she was not yet ready. In any case, the program has had poor statistical success. It conducts only around 1,000 conversions per year. Faced with this lack of success, and concerned especially about women who would determine the religious status of their children, the Misrad HaKlita in 2004 took a more aggressive stance and opened what was in effect an advertising campaign encouraging these immigrants to convert. It publicized the campaign with the slogan in Russian and Hebrew, "Conversion, it's not what you think." In 2014, the Ministry of Religious Service and the Prime Minister's Office launched a campaign using social media, among other things, promising attainable conversion, Giyyur bar hasaga, which was a pun, a play on the government's promise to provide diur bar hasaga, attainable housing. Addressing its audience in Russian and Hebrew, the campaign was clearly directed at immigrants from the former Soviet Union. This is one of, this is a photograph from a book, thus the black and white, but this is one of the images in this publicizing of attainable conversion campaign. And you see here a young woman with a nearly completed puzzle behind her, but with these scattered pieces with questions that this female potential convert might have. How will my child integrate into Israeli society? Will everyone recognize me as Jewish? Will I be able to have a Jewish wedding? And so on. These should be considerations for undertaking Giyyur. So I want to underscore here the obvious interest of the state and its ministries, if not the chief rabbinate, in converting non-Jewish former Soviet Union immigrants, and the equally apparent disinterest of most of the immigrants themselves. As of now, 500,000 or so Israeli citizens with FSU origins are registered as non-Jews, yet live as Jewish citizens in Israel, and to use a phrase adopted by scholars, they are sociological Jews. I should add that they're not interested, for the most part, in other more lenient conversion programs that operate outside the state apparatus, but whose conversions are not recognized by the chief rabbinate. For the most part, they consider themselves Jews just as they are. So finally, let me turn to the third context, modern context, one with very different contours than the two I've just discussed. From the 19th century onward, it became possible, thanks to modern communications and transportation, for Jews to make and sustain new contacts with remote communities that had long been cut off from the centers of Jewish life, including some whose claims to Jewish origins were impossible to prove. Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, ethnologist, labor Zionist, and the second president of Israel, was an enthusiast of a new, capacious vision of the Jewish people, one that included forgotten Jews and championed their resettlement in Israel. Scholars today often refer to these men and women collectively as emerging Jews, a name that I don't particularly like, but that is how they are described. Their discovery, again, discovery is not necessarily a very good term, was given mythical dimensions by the biblical concept of kibbutz galuyot, the ingathering of exiles. To Zionists, the emerging Jews who were becoming known to the Jewish world seemed to embody the very essence of galut. Their restoration was a religious and national obligation. These emerging Jews themselves had aspirations of their own, but that's a very complicated subject and not my concern here. I'll focus on just two cases briefly, in both of which outsiders inspired by the mythic drama of restoration, but also moved by the difficult conditions in which these hidden Jews, emerging Jews lived, took action to make possible the conversion and aliyah, or the aliyah and conversion of these people. The best known case, of course, is that of the Ethiopian Jews, the Beta Israel. Protestant missionaries in the mid-19th century reported about the possible Jewish origins of the group, and this excited the concern of European Jewish leaders. Publicity about them led to the lifelong campaign of a Polish-born French Jew, Jacques Fetlowitz, beginning in the early 20th century, to regenerate what he passionately believed to be a Jewish population. And it's no accident that he used this term, regeneration. This was a term that was coined by the Alliance Israélite Universelle, Kiach, to refer to its mission of transforming the Jews of the Middle East and North Africa by immersing them in French culture. Up to World War II, European and American Jewish organizations funded and conducted efforts on behalf of the Beta Israel. In the post-war period, the initiative passed to the Jewish Agency and other Israeli institutions. Between 1977 and 1993, the Israeli government, the IDF, and the Mossad organized much publicized airlifts that brought virtually all of the Beta Israel to Israel. And here is an iconic photograph of the immigrants being airlifted. Chief Rabbi Ovadia Yosef had already in 1973 declared that the Beta Israel were Jews in every respect. As such, he stated, quote, "It is our duty to redeem from assimilation, to hasten their immigration to Israel, to educate them in the spirit of our holy Torah, and to make them partners in the building of our sacred land. I am certain that the government institutions and the Jewish agency, as well as organizations in Israel and the diaspora, will help us to the best of our ability in this holy task." This was a collaborative project. It was a national project, a religious project undertaken by the State of Israel along with American and European Jewish organizations. What people tend to remember is the controversy that broke out around the chief rabbinate's initial requirement that the Ethiopian immigrants undergo Giyyur l'chumrah, a kind of symbolic Giyyur, a requirement that was later rescinded. But what I want to underscore here is the coordinated activity of many Jewish actors in bringing the Ethiopian Jews to Israel with the intent of converting them to Rabbinic Judaism with or without the rituals of Giyyur and integrating them into Jewish life. Less well known is the case of the B'nai Menashe of Northeast India. Protestant missionaries again may have been involved, suggesting to this particular tribe that they were one of the 10 lost tribes. In any case, in 1951, a mystic in their midst reported dreaming that they were descended from the Israelites, and this belief spread rapidly. In 1979, communal leaders of the B'nai Menashe established ties with the religious Zionist Rabbi Eliyahu Avichail, a disciple of Tzvi Yehuda Kook, who avidly sought out and proselytized remote groups he believed had origins in the lost tribes. With the support of Avichail's organization Amishav, small numbers of B'nai Menashe began arriving in Israel in 1989 on tourist visas. After studying for Giyyur and undergoing conversion, they qualified for citizenship under the law of return. And in 2004, the well-funded group Shavei Israel took over, arranging for conversions in India until the Indian government objected. So in these two cases, as in others, Jewish actors did not simply establish ties with and prepare for the conversion of members of these remote groups. They were instrumental in the funding and organizational work, transportation, immigration processing, housing, etc., that was vital for achieving their vision. Whatever the motivations of the converts themselves, it was external Jewish actors who choreographed their trajectory. So just a few words in conclusion. In the pre-modern period, the number of converts to Judaism was quite small. It was unlikely that non-Jews would take the risks involved in undergoing Giyyur unless they had powerful religious motivations, and Jews, for their part, would have refrained from anything that could possibly have been interpreted as an effort to attract converts from Islam or Christianity, and would have had no reason to convert a non-Jew whose aims were not l'shem shamayim. In the modern period, there were, of course, cases that fit the traditional model, that is, cases in which non-Jews driven by spiritual motivations sought to convert. But these were overwhelmingly outnumbered by cases of conversion for marriage. What I've tried to show here is that in the modern period, there was a quite new trend, especially in the post-war period, a kind of inversion of the traditional relationship between the potential convert and the Jewish community. Now, in some situations, it was Jews and Jewish entities who took the initiative in effectuating or trying to effectuate the conversion of non-Jews with motivations that, even if they had a religious aspect, were by no means purely religious. So I'd like briefly to consider the question I raised earlier, whether these three cases I've discussed, seemingly so different one from another, reflect a distinctly modern impulse and sensibility, and overall, I think they do. The conditions of modernity not only made possible organized efforts to bring about the conversion of non-Jews, but also produced the conceptual framework for imagining and implementing these efforts. the very notion of the possibility of transforming the identity and way of life of an entire group or population through active efforts is a modern phenomenon. And it's a banal point for me to make to you. There are countless examples, including in the Jewish orbit, one that I mentioned, the educational mission of the Alliance Israélite Universelle. An effort of this kind to transform a population was an intrinsic aspect of the Zionist movement, whose leaders dreamed of taking Yiddish-speaking diaspora Jews and making them into Hebrew-speaking soldiers and agriculturalists. This basic belief in the power of Zionism and the Jewish state to shape its citizens is clearly part of the thinking of Ben-Gurion, Shlomo Goren, and others in their lenient approaches to the conversion of non-Jewish immigrants. It need hardly be said that the absorption of Ethiopian and other emerging Jewish populations involved a complex mobilization of institutions and resources to achieve a no less dramatic transformation, one that involved not just instilling a basic grasp of rabbinic Jewish tradition, but achieving a linguistic, cultural, and identitarian transformation as well. And a similar underlying dynamic I believe, was at work when Reform leaders turned to unchurched non-Jews with outreach programs, confident that their movement had the potential to attract disinterested non-Jews if only it could effectively reach them and communicate to them the merits of their movement. So I think I've gone on long enough, and I would certainly like to hear if you have any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Miriam. It was truly very, very interesting. I'm sure we have questions. Whoever wants to start.
I suggest you shut the presentation, Melissa, Miriam, so we can see each other.
Ah,
Yeah.
this?
Please stop sharing, I guess.
Stop sharing.
I think it's below. Yeah.
Right.
It
Yeah.
worked?
Good. Yes. Stop
I
sharing.
think Oded had a question.
Thank you, Miriam. Very interesting. I would go back to the Middle Ages. When you talk about religious motivation, to what extent is you mean to theological motivation, and to what extent is the attractiveness of everyday life and commandments, customs, and so on?
Well, as I mentioned, it was really the contacts between sort of intense and intimate contacts between Jews and non-Jews. We find in the early modern period in the Protestant world, partly because of Calvinist interest, inherent interest in customs and the Old Testament in general, Old Testament history. But in the medieval period, there was much less contact between day-to-day contact between Jews and non-Jews, certainly on a religious level. In economic life, of course, there were many contacts in the marketplace, but not in the synagogue.
Mm.
And so while I certainly would not venture to say that it never happened that a medieval non-Jew was attracted to, and perhaps in the Islamic world, it may have been it may have been more common in the Islamic world, but I would just add that it was very dangerous. It was really very dangerous for them to even appear to be sort of trying out Jewish life, So I think it was too dangerous to really invite non-Jews to experiment in that way.
Mm. Okay, thank you.
I may have a question about the emerging Jewish communities today, or like people who now claim to be lost tribes of Israel. How would you categorize this category of aspiring converts? Would you say, in this case, the intention is clearly religious, or would you see other intentions, or do you have any other comments about like this new movement?
On the part of these people themselves?
Yeah, like in general, because their situation is very different from the one of the immigrants from former Soviet Unions who were probably like less religious and not claiming it themselves. In this case, in the case of the emerging Jewish communities and people claiming to be lost tribes of Israel, it's a clearly down top movement, right? It's like the people themselves are claiming it. It's not like the government trying to reach them in this case.
Uh, in terms of their, you're interested in their motivations?
Yeah, I wanted to, I was interested in your take about it since we were talking. Real,
I actually avoided the question of
uh,
their motivations because I think it's very complex. There are people with training of a kind I couldn't dream of having, anthropologists who have, done studies and clearly some people feel that one of the major motivations is to better their lives, and that is there can be, and people have mixed motivations, and the work of the Jews who did the organizing and the teaching and so on was certainly effective in many cases, but I prefer not to get into that because I think it's very complex, and
mhm.
and it's sensitive. I would say it's a sensitive issue.
Okay.
A sensitive issue, I think, because it's felt that Israelis think of them only as economic immigrants or as primarily economic immigrants. Um, and so 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 they're not necessarily, if you interview people who don't feel comfortable talking about their motivations, they may tell you what you want to hear. And I think that's more likely in this case than in some other cases
Mm-hmm.
because of all of the circumstances involved. Just
Okay, thank you. Someone else has a question?
Nadia has.
Nadia.
It's not exactly a question, it's more of a comment and maybe also a question. My comment is, in a way, very personal. It's very interesting because the ossuary you showed in the first image, it was something researched by my father, who was an anthropologist, and he determined that that guy, Yohanan, whatever, was crucified. And that makes it even more interesting if he was a girl. I mean, was he involved in some of the Jewish revolts or something? I mean, we don't know anything about his own history except for the analysis of the bones. But it really reminded me, I mean, it was so amazing that you showed this image and nothing else that I have to say it. Anyway, that's one thing. The other thing is more of a, well, historical comment. I did study a bit the Geniza Society many, many years ago, and I remember lists of Gerim who reached Fustat, and some of them appear in charity lists where they get allowances for flour or a special kind of bread that they bake it in the European style and so on, which means that there was such a movement and people did arrive in the Muslim world, probably because it was more difficult to remain in the Christian world. My third comment is that before the 12th or even say 13th century, there was no Inquisition. So there was no real persecution of people who were Judaizers or approached the Jews or tried to live as Jews. I mean, of course, it was frowned upon. Of course, they could have been ostracized, but there was no active persecution. Nobody really sought them out. So that's what I have to say.
It's yes, it's the case that bishops had the power to, if they knew of heresy in particular, could take action. But you're quite right that many of the converts to Judaism in Christian lands escaped to Muslim lands. It was actually in Muslim lands, it was prohibited to convert to any religion except Islam. But
Yes.
if they were converted before they came, then it didn't matter.
Like Ovadia Ger, more or less.
Right.
Miriam, you have a question in the chat. Someone wrote you a question in the chat. So if you click on it, you're going to see it. From Zuhair.
From Zuhair, could you very briefly provide insights on converts to Judaism from formerly Muslim backgrounds? Could you provide insight into Ovadia Hager, a formerly Muslim scholar or possibly an imam who lived in the 12th century and is referred to by Maimonides in his letter to Ovadia the proselyte? Yes. What I can say is that the Geniza is a very rich source of information on converts, you say from formerly Muslim backgrounds. I assume that includes in Muslim lands. It's thought that Ovadia Hager, the one I mentioned, the Ovadia Hager I mentioned is a different one from Italy, from southern Italy. The Ovadia Hager who corresponded with Maimonides, with the Rambam, was possibly a Muslim, but we don't know. You say a formerly Muslim scholar. I'm not sure if there's some information you're referring to that I don't know about. But he did turn to Maimonides in Egypt.
I think the question was also in general about Muslim converting to Judaism, to know a bit more about that.
We don't have the rich material that we have for the Christian world, and certainly not after the Geniza period. Once Geniza, even studying conversion to Judaism in modern Islamic lands, there's just very little literature. But if you're asking me to provide insight, that is, what were his motivations, perhaps, we don't really know. What we know is that Maimonides thought very highly of him. He was an intellectual and with some theological sophistication who understood that rabbis who had spoken to him were, as Maimonides pointed out, not as smart as he was, to put it in very simple terms. But we don't really know what his motivations for converting were. We're always dependent on materials, and it was partly because of the polemical arguments of converts, Christian converts to Judaism, that we know more about them. And I think just generally after the 13th century, 14th century, certainly, there are simply more records. There's more documentary evidence in the Christian world than in the Muslim world.
I was wondering in the Middle Age, since you said that most of the people who would convert to Judaism were religious or nobles, and like basically people who really studied the text and would want to do it, although they were risking their lives. I was wondering if in this case it was mostly like men converting alone to Judaism, or did we have families?
It's a very good question. Certainly, the friars, the religious Christians, were single men, and those are the main ones we know about.
Yeah.
I can think of only, there were two sisters who wanted to convert, Christian sisters who wanted to convert, and the rabbi they approached apparently turned them away, and they said they would complain to heaven and burst into tears, and were accepted for conversion. But that's very unusual.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Someone else has a question?
Yeah.
Jackie.
First of all, thank you very much for really this masterful integration of such a long period of history on this topic. I'm curious about sort of perhaps the theological influences of conversion, both on the part of the converters and on the part of those who convert. When do we know about converts carrying over, say, their previous religious background and making an influence then on the way that Judaism is shaped, either theologically or in terms of community life? I'm thinking of, for example, the very visible presence of Christian clergy or students who become rabbis and Jewish community leaders in Germany, very often descendants of active, sometimes descendants of active Nazis. And how does then their conversion and their position, say, in as rabbis and communities as spokesmen, then influence community life? And I wonder if there are other, precedents that enable us, to think of this. I'm thinking of, the Rashi's comment on the Talmud that says, he says, "Kashim gerim k'Yisrael kesapachat," right? Converts are as difficult for Israel as, well, skin disease,
A leprous scab.
Leprous scab, right? And Rashi's comment is, he says, "Dimidaktikin b'mitzvot tfei," because they are too scrupulous, overly scrupulous in their performance of the commandments. And is there, for example, other things that show that converts are going to make an influence on the larger Jewish life of the larger community? And if I can, one more thing, if you could tell us a little bit about, groups like Eliashiv and others, to what extent do they see this conversion not only as a kind of a barrier, as part of a messianic scenario?
Okay, your first question is a wonderful question, and I think about it a lot. We don't necessarily have good information, but it stands to reason. It stands to reason that people who are conditioned from early childhood in a religious tradition are going to grasp it differently from people who in adulthood convert. And I don't think there's any question about that, but we don't necessarily, there aren't necessarily good examples. There is one certainly very clear example, and that is, and it's not conversion in the usual sense of the word, and that is the area that I have specialized in my career, the conversos of Spain and Portugal, those who settled in the community of Amsterdam, I know in particular, but elsewhere as well. Yes, even their crypto-Judaism was not necessarily consistent with, not at all necessarily consistent with rabbinic Judaism. And we certainly see institutions, for example, their biblicism was something that had to do with their experience of being in an environment in which the only Jewish text they had was the Old Testament. And that had an impact on, I feel certain, had an impact on their grasp of Jewish tradition and their particular interest in the biblical. I wish we knew more. I think it's a great topic. I think it just stands to reason. It just has to be that people who are not raised in a tradition will grasp it differently. I don't know how you would put together a study. Your second question about the rabbinic
By the way,
figure.
on the other way around, you have, the Amnon Raz Krakotkin's argument that the Jewish converts to Christianity, who then became censors, in some ways are the harbingers of a kind of Jewish identity that separates between a faith, in this case Christianity, to which they were committed, and a Jewish belonging that they were also committed to, and then did that through their selective censoring of anti-Christian things in the text. So, it's the other way around, and the converts the other way, but
Actually, there's some interesting studies of Christian theologians who were Jews in Spain, and in Spain in particular. Yossi Israeli has done some really interesting work. And yes, there's certainly, he points to ways in which there's this kind of gravitational pull of the original tradition from which they come, even after conversion. And actually, Dov Stuczynski has also argued that converts to Christianity from Judaism who became theologians and intellectuals were attracted to what he calls Paulinism, that is, the teachings of Paul as a stream of Christian thinking that was more acceptable to them.
mm-hmm.
Pauline, a kind of Pauline Christianity that was heavily influenced by their Jewish background.
Messianism? Current messianism on the part of the converts?
Oh, the messianism.
Yeah.
Given my reading, it's not something I specialize in. Given my reading, I haven't seen it. I think it's a good question. Are they actually speeding or facilitating the coming of the Messiah by returning these people from lost tribes to Eretz Israel? Maybe. I can't answer the question. I don't know.
Okay, thank you very much.
Interesting.
We have a last question. We may take it, and then we're going to conclude because it's already late. Otherwise, thank you so much to everyone, and good luck with everything we're going through. Hopefully, we'll meet very soon in peace.
Yes, thank you. Let me wish everyone a Besorot Tovot.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. It was fascinating, and it was a pleasure to meet in
Yeah.
these times,
Thank you, Daniela.
Thank you,
even though
Miriam.
on Zoom. Yeah, thank you,
Miriam,
Aya.
Thank you.
Thank
yes,
you.
I apologize to everyone for the
And,
trouble
and,
getting
and,
started.
and thank you all for participating.
Yeah, it was well worth the wait. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.